And I'm going to tell you his story, and I'm going to tell you about all of that. I want to start with this. You guys know who this is? Yeah, you guys like this guy? Okay, I'm from New York, so whatever you think about him, I think even less of him. Except, I want to show you something.
Who's my hero? It's a great question. Well, I think my dad is my hero because he's someone that I look up to every day. And my dad.
All right. Tom Brady, look the way he thinks about his father. All of us think about our parents that way, I think, in one way or another. And if you don't right now, you will, I promise you. Let me get this back. Okay. This is my dad. This is my dad when he was about 12 years old, so give or take somewhere around your age. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of him. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think when you guys hear about survivor, or you hear the term is usually applied to somebody who's gone through either concentration camp or come close to having gone through concentration camp during World War II. Usually applies to Jews, but not always. But when you hear the term survivor, you're going to think about maybe someone you've met. And if you've met any, they're going to be really old. They're going to be older than your grandparents. Or possibly, you might see photos of people during the war in concentration camp. And when you see them, they'll be emaciated, they'll be walking stick figures. What you're probably not going to see is what they really look like in the real world. This is my dad when he's your age. It's 1937 or 1938. He's standing, being taken a picture in good clothes. Here he is, he's 15 years old. He's just a little bit older than you are, and I don't know who the girl is. And I'm curious. This is my dad when he was 17. When he was 17 years old, he was actually a model. He was the guy that this photographer in town used to use for pictures to advertise either what his photography studio did, or he would advertise people's clothes. And this is one of the photos that came out of that. In this picture, my dad's 35, so he's somewhere around the age of your parents. And that's my mom with him. And finally, in this picture, he would be essentially your grandparents' age, and those are my daughters who are now in their 20s. So just to give you a quick run through what my father's life looked like. He was born on July 13th, 1925. His father was an Austro-Hungarian. So Austro-Hungary doesn't exist anymore, but before World War I, there was a large country called Austro-Hungary, which is now Austria and Hungary. My grandfather, his father, was an Austro-Hungarian cavalry soldier. Cavalry soldiers back then were kind of the equivalent of what like the Navy SEALs or the Delta Force are today. He was the youngest of 8, so my father had 7 brothers and sisters, and a total of 25 people in their family, and that's an important number, as I'll show you in a couple of minutes. On June 6, 1944, my father and his family were put into cattle cars and sent to Auschwitz. Do you guys know what else happened on June 6th, anybody? Yeah, D-Day. It was the invasion of France by Allied soldiers. It was sort of the beginning of the end of World War II. On May 6, 1944, my father was rescued by the U.S. Army. This was after his second escape. Now, that's where my book goes. I just mentioned a couple more dates just so you see. He spent 18 months in the hospital after the war. He spent 18 months there because, first of all, he weighed 75 pounds when he was rescued. He was a guy my size. Imagine that. Secondly, he had pneumonia and a disease called typhus and a disease called peritonitis. The guy had an incredible number of diseases for somebody who was still walking and escaping. So he spent 18 months in a hospital. He went back to his hometown, and a year later, in 1947, he went to Israel. And 11 years after that, I was born, and it came to the United States, and he died in 2001. So now I'm going to get into his story. In November 1943, the Germans came to his hometown. His town was called Dej. It was, as I said, in Austro-Hungary. It was actually in an area called Transylvania. You guys heard of Transylvania? Right, Dracula? Okay, he didn't know Dracula. They came from Transylvania, and what happened was the Germans were in charge of, or around their country that entire time, but no German troops had come to town for the simple reason that the prime minister, or actually they were called a regent in Hungary, had good relations with the Germans, so they decided not to bring troops in. But in November 1943, they did. And my father, in his house, had to put up 4 German soldiers. And some of these soldiers even warned him and his family that something bad was coming, but no one believed it, because what could possibly be bad? We have a regent, we have a prime minister who's taking care of us, we're good. Turned out not to be the case. And on May 3rd, 1944, my father and his family were put into a ghetto. Have you guys heard of ghettos? Okay. Normally, when you hear of a ghetto, like there's a famous ghetto in Venice. There's a famous ghetto in Warsaw. There was a famous Warsaw uprising where Jews fought back against the Nazis. When you hear of a ghetto, you think of a city or a corner of a city. Like take a little corner of Chicago where there's a lot of high-rises and load people in there with 2 or 3 families to an apartment. That is what you think of when you think of a ghetto, but not in my father's case. In my father's case, it was a field. 7,500 Jews in this town were sent to a field and said, you guys, you live here now. Imagine that. In early June of 1944, my father and his family were sent to concentration camps. Now, when you hear the term concentration camp, it sounds like a broad brush term, but there were actually 2 kinds. One kind was actually a death camp, camps like Birkenau and Treblinka. The idea was, you go there, you're killed, usually in gas chambers. Birkenau had gas chambers that would kill 1,000 people at a time. And Jews were sent there, mostly to be killed. But then there were labor camps. Auschwitz was not only a death camp, it had another camp, Auschwitz I, which was a labor camp. Labor camps, the idea was they would feed you terribly, they would treat you miserably, but you weren't necessarily going there to be killed. You were going there to work because you were able-bodied and they wanted to put you to work. They were rated 1 to 3. Most of them were a 1. 1 or 2 of them were 2. The worst of them were 3s. There was 1, 3. It was called Mauthausen, and it was where my father was sent. So on June 6, 1944, 22 people in my father's family were put into cattle cars and sent first to Auschwitz. This is what my father's family looked like when they went in. There was my grandparents, Malka and Joseph. There were 8 brothers and sisters. 5 of them were married, that's the second line of green, and then there were 10 kids. The little reds were 3 members of the family that did not go to concentration camp that day. My grandfather, he had died a few weeks before. And then an uncle of mine, and then an uncle through marriage, they were sent into what's called work battalions. They were sent into the Austrian countryside to build bridges and to build roads, and so they didn't go to concentration camp. So 22 people went to concentration camps. This is all that was left a week later. 4 survived. Those 4 survived not only the beginning, but they survived the entire war. My father on the left, the youngest, and then 2 uncles and an aunt. This is just so you can see sort of graphically where they went from. So I have a pointer, which is good. So they started engaged in my father's hometown. They go to Auschwitz. It took 1 night in the train. And by the way, it wasn't a comfortable train. They were packed in like sardines. Couldn't sit, had to stand, packed in close together, 24 hours. And then from Auschwitz, 3 days later, my father spent 3 nights in the train going to Mauthausen in Austria. Auschwitz is in Poland, Mauthausen is in Austria. So my father went to Mauthausen, but Mauthausen had a satellite camp called Gusen 2 miles away, 2.5 miles away. And Gusen was actually 2 camps, Gusen 2 over here, and right next to it, Gusen 1. Both of these camps held people who worked in this rock mine. It was a granite mine. Now granite mines, you think of a mine, you usually think of something underground. Not this mine, it was a rock wall. It was 100 feet high and about 1/4 mile wide. And it was over here. And this building that you can barely see is called the stone crusher. And my father worked near and around the stone crusher for most of his time. The yellow, the line, the road, that road still exists today. And in fact, this camp, although the camp no longer exists, the area does, and it's a housing community. And I talked to kids exactly your age about 2 months ago in a school that was right here, right off the edge of the road. So kids still live in this place now. One more building I want to show you, because I'll talk about it in a minute. It's here. It's called a Jurhaus. It's a German word. It doesn't have a direct English translation, but it was used as an administrative building. Sometimes it was a prison. Sometimes it was an entranceway. It had lots of different uses. I'll show you a picture in a minute. So here's a picture taken right after the war of where my father worked. Here's the mine, 100-foot high wall, about a quarter of a mile wide. And here's that building, the stone crusher. And right here, that you can barely see, these are actually little mine wagons. You guys know what mine wagons are? These things on train tracks. They're small, they're about my chest high. And you load them up with rocks and you push them or move them or have a train pull them. So this is what it looked like from a distance. This is what the stone crusher looked like close up, and these are the mine wagons again. This door here, this kind of garage-like door, that's where my father worked as a slave in a concentration camp. And I walked it. When I went there a few years ago, I walked exactly where my father was when he was an 80 or 85-pound slave for the Germans. This is the Jura house I mentioned to you. This is the building in 1940. It actually was an entrance to the camp. You can see you could drive trucks through here. And it was an administrative office, and it was a torture center, and it was a prison. And here is what it looks like today. A family lives there. They do well, they drive a Porsche, and yes, it shocked me when I discovered this. Okay, this is what my father did in the camps. First, he lived in Gusen 2, the camp that was sort of on your left. And when he lived there, he worked in the rock mine itself, loading rocks and taking rocks off the wall. Then they moved him to Gusen 1, and he spent about 5 months there. And when he lived in Gusen 1, his job was, it was called the Stone Crusher Commando. Commando is actually a British word they use all the time. Groups of army soldiers are called commandos. The Germans use it too, they spell it with a K, and it basically means a group of soldiers, and they also applied it to mean a group of concentration camp prisoners. So my father was in the Stone Crusher, and this photo was taken at the concentration camp and shows exactly what my father did. What he did was, when he took the rock off the rock wall, he put it into a central storage area. That storage area was a terminus for these mine wagons. My father went, loaded a mine wagon, pushed it 200 yards to the building I showed you, the Stone Crusher, and unloaded it. Then pushed it back empty, loaded it again, and unloaded it. These rocks all weigh between 40 and 60 and 70 pounds. And he did this all day, every day, rain or shine, and they fed him next to nothing. They fed him a piece of bread for breakfast, soup for lunch, soup for dinner. And not soup like you guys are used to, basically water. And he dropped from 150, 160. Let me ask you guys a question. So, all of you over 5'9", will you stand up for me a second? If you're over 5'9", boys or girls, just stand up. Okay, now imagine yourself at 75 pounds. Think of what you weigh now. Imagine yourself at 75 pounds. And what I'm going to tell you from now to the end of this presentation about my dad, that's what he weighed. You at 75 pounds. Imagine, because I ask myself all the time, can I do what I'm about to tell you guys that he did? So while you're listening to this, put that in context. Thanks for standing up. So my father worked in this Stone Crusher Commando for 5 months, and then they put him in an infirmary. Now, an infirmary in German is called Krankenrevier. My father always called it a Revier, like Paul Revere. So whenever he would tell the story, he'd go, I went to the Revier. They put him in there because he was that close to death, but he stayed alive, didn't die. In December of 1944, they moved my father from Gusen to Mauthausen, 2 miles away, and kept him in the Revier. This is what Mauthausen looks like, and if it looks like sort of like a castle from the Middle Ages, they did that on purpose. The Germans built this camp. Remember, it was a Stufe 3. It was the hardest, harshest camp that wasn't a death camp in the Reich. And they built it to look like a medieval castle just to scare the daylights out of the people who lived there, who were prisoners there. This is a picture of something called the Sonnetslager or Russenlager. The word in parentheses I'm going to talk about for a second. Russen is Russian. Lager is German for camp. When this was first built, this was right next to my house, and I mean literally like 10 yards away. When this was first built, the idea was to put Russian prisoners. They had about 1,000 Russian prisoners in the camp, and they were going to house them there. But in the year it took to build what you see here, they had killed all the Russian prisoners, so they didn't need it anymore. That's how harsh this place was. And so because they were all dead, they decided to make it into an infirmary. And my father actually spent 2 months there. And then in the end of February, March of 1945, they moved him to something called the tent camp. Now, I had a diagram, and it's hard to follow, so I'm just going to describe it to you. My housing was on top of a hill, and it looked like this castle on top of a hill. Just to the south side, 10 yards away, was what you see here, Russenlager, Sanitätslager. On the other side, they started to move Jews into the camp. There were very, very few Jews in this camp until March of 1945. When they started to move Jews in, they had nowhere to put them. So they built tents on the other side of the camp, and they called it the tent camp. And it was such a terrible place to live and to exist that my father never even talked about it. All it was tents. No sanitary facilities, very little food. It was, if the camp itself was bad enough, this was horrific. And my father spent a month there. Okay, but now, we get to the beginning of April 1945, and they start death marches. Have you guys heard the term death marches at all? Okay, my father told the story about what happened to him twice a year, at least. He told it every time on Passover, and he would tell it some other time. The reason he told it on Passover was because Passover is the story of the Jews leaving Egypt, or escaping from Egypt 3,000 years ago. And so he would add on the story of him escaping from concentration camp. But when he told the story, he didn't call it a death march. He called it a transport. Transport is an English word, you guys have all heard it. It's also a German word, and it simply means something that takes you from point A to point B. So my dad didn't call it a death march, but what happened was this. As I told you, in February of 1945, the Germans started to take Jews from the surrounding concentration camps up to 100 miles away, and they force marched them, or death marched them, to this camp. Now, if you weigh 75 or 85 pounds and you're told to march 50 or 75 or 100 miles, you're not making it. More than half the Jews who went on these marches died on these marches, which is why they ended up being called death marches. So what happened was, in February and March, they moved the Jews from the surrounding area to the tent camp in Mauthausen. And starting in April, they started moving 500 to 1,000 Jews at a time, 34 miles away to another concentration camp. Now this camp had nothing. All it was barbed wire and a couple of bunks. No food at all, no water at all, and they were expected to stay there and ultimately to die there, because with no food and no water and no sanitation, you're going to die. If you didn't die on the 34-mile march. So in the beginning of April, my father was on one of the very first marches. He started at the end, that's my house. It's downhill to the river, the Danube River. You cross the river, and you went down to that number 1 on the bottom. That number 1 on the bottom is 6 miles away, and it's where my father escaped the first time, and I'll describe it in 1 second. A few weeks after he was recaptured, he was put on another death march, again 34 miles away, to go 34 miles. Again, he took the same exact route. He got to that number 1, couldn't escape, got to the number 2, and I'll tell you what happened there in a minute. So let's talk about the first escape. So my father is 75 pounds, the way I described it to you guys a few minutes ago. He's marching with his marchers down the yellow route, and he makes a right turn. The first part of the yellow, I'm going to take this off, it's easier. This first part of the yellow is actually an uphill, a steep uphill. If he wasn't exhausted by this point, he is toast by the time he comes here, into this part here. The red line is refugees, soldiers and refugees who are escaping from the fighting, and they're actually going north, while my father is going west. Because of the crowd of refugees, they decided to stop the line of marchers, my father's marchers in his death march, right behind my father. My father's really, really straggling. He's moving as slowly as you can imagine. The refugees can't wait. They decide, we're going, and they go. And all of a sudden, my father looks up, and he's caught up with all these refugees. And my father gets this lightning idea. Well, if I just turn with them, maybe nobody will notice. And he turned with them. And he goes 2 steps, and he sees a raincoat on the ground. He puts the raincoat on. Now, his hair, all the concentration camp prisoners, Jews and non-Jews, they had, you guys know what a mohawk is, right? A reverse mohawk. They shaved you in the middle of your head. And they did it so that if you tried to escape and you got out to the countryside, and everybody would know who you were. But they stopped shaving people like in January. And so by the time they got to March, in April, the mohawk look was kind of gone. So now my father's wearing a raincoat over his prison uniform. You can't tell from his hair. And he realizes, I'm free. And he walks a little bit. But remember, he was near death right here. So he's exhausted. He goes 100 yards right to this yellow arrow right here. There's homes there. I don't know which home it was, but on one of those homes, my father knocked on the door. And my father spoke eight languages fluently. And when he didn't speak English, but when he spoke English later, 9 languages. And he spoke German fluently. And an old woman answers the door, and she says, "Can I help you?" And he says, "I'm hungry, would you feed me?" And she said, "Yes." She invited him in, and she put him into her backyard, and she gave him some cheese and noodles. And after about 20 minutes, she must have thought about it. She said, "Well, what do I just do?" So she went back to my dad and she said, "You have to go. But my father's just a little older than you guys. He's 19 years old. And for the first time in a year, he's sitting on grass. And for the first time in a year, he's had a decent meal." And he says, "Yeah, okay, I'm going in a minute." But he's not going that fast. It's a beautiful day and he's good. She sees 2 SS soldiers patrolling outside and she calls them in. She says, "I've got a Jew in my backyard, go get him." They come in and they take my dad and they debate what they should do with him. They debate in German, not realizing my father's understanding everything they say. And should we kill him here? Should we kill him in the street? They decide to take him to the local police station, which was actually lucky for my dad. The local cop is called a gendarme. You guys heard the term gendarme? A gendarme is like, the state police? Well, countries have police forces, and the police forces are called gendarmerie. And a single soldier or policeman is called a gendarme. So the gendarme looks at my dad and he looks at these SS guys, and it happened that in Germany, the gendarme had the same rank as the SS, and he outranked these SS troopers. And he said to them, "You guys go, I got this prisoner." And he said to my dad, "What are you doing here?" And my dad told him the story of how he escaped. And then my father said to him, now I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure he did because I know my dad, and I can imagine if you guys were in the same position, you might do this. My dad said, "No, my father fought for the same country that you fought for in World War I, because the gendarme was an older guy. All the younger guys were in the war." And the gendarme looked at my dad and he said, "You know what? I'm going to put you in jail for the night. I'm going to feed you dinner. I'm going to feed you breakfast, and I'm going to get you back to the camp. I'm going to make sure they take you back." And it worked. Right? I can't think of anybody who escaped from the Nazis and wasn't killed outright. My dad got away with it. So they took him back to the camp. My father spent about 10 days there, and there was another forced march. Another death march. This time, my father gets past the same intersection. There are no more refugees. The fight is really close. All the refugees are done. All the soldiers are now in the middle of the war and not going north and south. And my father goes another mile to where that second mark was here. The number 2 over here. And he can't go an inch further. This photo that I took a few years ago is exactly where my father went to the side of the road. Here was the rule in the death marches. If you went to the side of the road, they killed you, shot you in the back of the head. Sometimes the soldier shooting you might say, either get up or I have to shoot you. Sometimes they didn't. In my father's case, it was late in the afternoon. It was like 6 in the afternoon. It was drizzling. It was cold. It was April, but it was really, really cold. SS soldier puts a gun in the back of my father's neck, and my father said the cold steel shocked him, and he stood up. Now, by standing up, the SS guy decided not to shoot him, and he walked away holstering his pistol. My father looked behind him and saw 2 more SS guys, but they're walking backwards. They're not looking. Right where my father was, there were no marchers. And right to his right, there was what you see. There was a bridge that covered a very, very small stream. There was a wall. And right in between where that pile of dirt is, that pile of dirt wasn't there, but the bushes and trees were right there. There's a path. It's a shortcut to the local train station a mile away. My father looked at the path, looked at the soldiers, not looking at him, and said, "I'm going," and went. And bolted as fast as he could, about 10 yards, and then threw himself into the bushes, and no one saw him do it. He spent the night there. And overnight, he came out. There was no traffic on the road now, nobody out there, but people had been dying all the way along in this death march. And it happened that if you weren't in a concentration camp, but you were in a labor camp, like where I told you my uncles had gone to build roads and bridges, if you were in a labor camp, you were not in a concentration camp uniform. And my father found a dead guy on the side of the road about his size, and he changed into his clothes. Remember, my dad hasn't had a real meal other than what that old woman fed him in a year. He weighs 75 pounds. He's in enemy territory, and he had the wherewithal to take this guy, take his clothes off, and put him on. And then my father went to sleep. And in the morning, he gets woken up by voices. It's a couple. They're walking towards him. And they're saying, they stand right over him. My father's playing dead. And they go, he doesn't look dead. And they start debating whether he's dead or not. And they decide to leave him alone, and they walk away. When they're out of earshot, my father gets up. It's now like 6 o'clock in the morning, and he starts to walk down the path. My father didn't know where this couple had gone. It turns out not only had the couple gone down the path, but they turned around. And there happened to be sort of a bend, and right at the bend, my father runs into them. And they stop him, and the woman says, "Was that you lying back there, pretending you're dead?" My father says, "Yeah, that was me." And I remember they're talking German. And I say to my father, "Well, who are you?" And my father says, "I'm an escaped Czechoslovakian prisoner from Mudhouse." He doesn't say he's a Jew. He says, "I'm Czechoslovakian." He took a guess. Czechoslovakia is only 40 miles away. So I'm an escaped Czechoslovakian prisoner. And they go, "Oh, we've got tons of family in Czechoslovakia. Are you hungry?" And my father says, "Well, duh." So, okay. They say, "Go back to where we saw you pretending you were dead," because it was a good hiding place. "Go back there. We'll bring you food in an hour. And tonight, we'll come back with our horse and carriage, our horse and cart, and we'll take you back to our place." And they did that. This is the couple. Barbara Friedman. It's the only photo I have. Yes, I wish I had a better photo. But that's Barbara Friedman, and I love her. She saved my father's life. And that's Ignaz in his World War I uniform. They were both in their 50s, so they were probably around your parents' age or older at the time they ran into my dad. Remember, my dad is just a little older than you, and they're basically his parents. And this is where they lived. This was their house. And I'll show you something interesting about their house. This upstairs, their name were Friedmans. I know Friedman sounds like a Jewish name. It wasn't. They were not Jewish. The upstairs, the Friedmans were keeping SS soldiers. And this door, there are two doors back here. One of these doors led upstairs, and the other door led downstairs to a room in their house called a Kuhstall. Kuhstall means cow stall or cow den. You know the way some houses have a room in the front where the family hangs out? Well, they had a room in the front where they kept animals. It was very common in Austria, particularly in farm country. They kept my dad there. So one door leads upstairs to the SS, and one door leads downstairs to my father, and they kept him there in total for 3 weeks. But after the first week, they came to my dad and they said, the fighting is getting really close, and we're getting nervous that people are going to find you here. So we have a barn. Remember, he's actually